Good afternoon. I'm Arunabha Ghosh, CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. I'm delighted to be here for the second time on the Hero Future Energy as part of Think Twitter chat. This time I'm with Mr. Paolo Frankl, who's the head of the Renewable Energy Division of the International Energy Agency. We are delighted that Paolo has joined us this year too to be part of the CEW annual Renewable Energy Dialogue. We're also delighted that this year we are formally partnering with the International Energy Agency. In fact, tomorrow we'll be releasing a joint document focusing on renewable energy investment trends in India that CEW and IEA have published together. What we wanted to do in today's Twitter chat, and we really hope that you will send in your questions, is focus a little bit about where we see the renewable energy market heading in the middle of 2018. Exactly a year ago, there was a lot more enthusiasm in India. Tariffs had fallen to some of the lowest levels ever, and we thought that they would continue to fall. But that has not really panned out over the course of the last 12 months, even as India has deployed more in terms of investment in renewables as opposed to thermal power for the first time in the last financial year. So Paolo, I'm going to turn to you first and ask you, sitting where you sit in Paris and overseeing the entire renewable energy space in the world, how do you see the developments of the last 12 months? How would you describe them?
First, let me tell you that I'm delighted to be here and also being part of this discussion. Now, from our indeed privileged position at the International Energy Agency in Paris, we not only look at renewables in the whole world, but we look at all technologies. So the first thing that I would like to say is that renewables are the fastest energy technologies of all. Some renewables, of course, are developing fast, in particular solar photovoltaics and wind onshore. There is a dramatic technology progress, a dramatic cost reductions, and even, as you said, 1 year ago there were more enthusiasm, not only in India but also in other places. I would say that the fundamentals, so in terms of cost reduction, in terms of competitiveness, in terms of potential, remain very strong for a number of renewable technologies across the board. And if you want to have a benchmark in our market forecast, I'm speaking about the forecast for the next 5 years, not the scenario. We forecast around 1,000 gigawatt of additional capacity of renewables to be installed in the world. Now, 1,000 gigawatt may mean nothing for a non-expert, but consider the following benchmark. This is equal to the half of the total capacity of coal, cumulative capacity of coal installed in the world that required 80 years to be built. So in 5 years, renewables are adding the half of what coal built in 80 years. I think this is a very good indicator of how fast this transition is going on, with some ups and downs. We may speak about this later, but definitely, inevitably, going forward very quickly.
This is fantastic news that what has been achieved in thermal power, particularly coal, for 80 years, half of that can be achieved in renewables within the next 5 years. But tell us what or which region is driving this growth? Which country is the locomotive of the renewable energy market?
The first locomotive is definitely China. That's already for many years, and it's even more so in the 5 years to come, despite some policy changes and up and downs in that country as well, because they had an overheated solar market in particular last year, so they introduced very recently some policy changes to slow down the market.
Right.
But in absolute numbers, China is the number one in solar, in wind, now even in bioelectricity, in hydro, in basically all, in electric vehicles, in almost all technologies that on renewables they are the champion. And then comes the number two. And the number two in terms of cumulative installment remains Europe, because Europe was the forefront runner.
Sure.
where everything started, in particular countries like Germany. But when you look at growth, there is no doubt that there will be 3 countries region at the same level, and India is the new one in these 3. So if the United States, despite what I would call some federal policy uncertainties, remains very strong because the fundamentals of renewables are strong in the United States, because the policies of the states, of the single states, or even of the cities and even the corporates are very strong and are increasing the demand of renewables. The second is Europe, which just passed a more ambitious regulation 1 week, 10 days ago.
That's right.
With higher targets than were proposed
That's
by
right.
the European Commission. So for the first time after a number of years, there is a push up. And then is India at the same level. We see a demand of renewables growing in India exactly at the same order of level of the US and Europe, and that's the big news, which I see. Now, these 3 groups of countries then equal and even surpass China globally, so this is the big motor of development of renewables. Then there is then the last 2 world regions and continents. Latin America is the champion of renewables, but the numbers are slow. And Africa is the missing continent, where the potential is huge. It's enormous. The population is growing, and in principle, it would have the potential to totally leapfrog to an economic development based on renewables. But so far, the financial flows go somewhere else. The risk of investment in Africa remains too high. The cost of financing is too high, and as a consequence, the renewables deploy somewhere else.
We'll come back to Africa in a bit, but let's stay with India. You say India is sort of in the same pack as the United States and Europe, but if you talk to market watchers here, that's not always the sentiment that is expressed. Are we just being, overly critical about our own market here? Or are we being pessimistic? What would a layperson who does not know the ins and outs of renewable energy, how would that layperson realize that this is a massive energy transition underway in India?
I would say simply that given the fact that you have less experience historically than Europe and the United States, there is a little bit less tools to assess how quickly you're going. And this is understandable that some people still have concerns, that some people think this is a lot of blah blah, very ambitious targets, but in the end nothing will really change quickly. It's understandable that with less experience you have less confidence that that this transition is for real and is not just a political wish, let's say. But from our perspective, we judge concrete actions. We don't, for instance, I can say it, historically India has presented a number of targets, and we systematically have declared India will not reach these targets. We are changing this attitude because we see concretely that India is addressing the right questions that hamper the deployment of renewables, be it system integration, be it financial affordability, the affordability and the financial health of discoms, be it market design and institutional setting. So from our perspective, we have a more positive maybe view of this criticism that you just expressed. A caveat, obviously barriers exist. I'm not pretending here everything is perfect, and a lot of work needs still to be done. We think it can be done in India, and India can emerge as a big world player.
Paolo, when we launched our solar mission in 2010, we had less than 18 megawatts of solar.
Yes.
And even many of those who worked on climate change and wanted an energy transition for the world, even within India, many were skeptical that India itself could be part of that renewable energy story. And historically what has happened is that we waited for technologies to be developed somewhere else and then adopted. And I think what we've what is different this time round is while, as you mentioned earlier, Europe drove a lot of the initial growth, which brought down prices. Then the US and then China building its manufacturing capacity. All that has, of course, helped India. But even vis-a-vis our total energy in electricity system of about 330 gigawatts plus, to have an ambition of having 175 gigawatts is a fundamental transition. It is basically saying that, you know, more than half of what currently exists, we are going to now change over. So the question to you is, how do we take some of the lessons from India to the rest of the world? You know, did we jump off a cliff? And if we did, and we are continuing to fly, is there a lesson from the Indian experience of Latin America and Africa?
That's a good question. I think the two situations are different, because I consider Latin America very advanced.
Sure.
There, the deployment of renewables is basically hampered by economic development, which is not very strong. Otherwise, it will just go much faster. In Africa, I think that the lessons that you're learning now, in terms of financial affordability, how to look at the financial risk, how to de-risk investments in renewables to really scale up, how to put a policy which has not just ambitious targets, but then a number of very concrete policy steps in order to achieve those targets. I'm not saying that you will reach them 100%, but
Sure.
I'm saying there is an immense progress with respect to the past. As you just said, you grew by a factor of 1,000.
Yes,
Exactly. In less than 10 years, in 8 years. So this I call progress, for even for a layman. That's very, very clear. I think that part, how to make a consistent long-term vision which has ambitious targets, concrete policy steps, and look at the reality of what happens in the world, which is the bankability of projects, how to de-risk investment, how to make investments in renewables more attractive from my financial point of view than the ones on fossil fuels. That's the lesson that probably can be transported from India to Africa. And in that respect, I would say that a big role could be played by the International Solar Alliance, which has one dedicated work stream precisely on de-risking investment of solar.
Right.
And given the fact that a lot of member countries are African countries, that could be a tool in order to accelerate and to disseminate the lesson from India.
For the benefit of our viewers, those of you who don't know, the International Solar Alliance is the world's newest international organization, intergovernmental organization. It was championed by India and France at the COP21 climate negotiations in 2015, and it was born as a formal organization in late 2017, and in March this year the founding conference of the ISA was held with more than 45 countries represented, and now there are 66 member countries who have signed up. Please keep sending in your questions. We have a question from Utkarsh, Paolo. Do you think policy formulation at the center level will be of prime importance for benchmarking the solar energy and wind energy? How far is our power industry growth adequate against vis-a-vis other developed countries? So I guess there are two questions, I guess, here. One is how much of the focus of the policy push, you were mentioning earlier that India is putting in policy and trying to implement, how much of the focus should be of what the central government is doing, and how much focus should there be at the provinces? And the second question there is, how do we benchmark our growth against other developed countries? And you mentioned earlier that we are kind of similar to EU and to US, but are there particular characteristics that are different for India versus, so is there more utility scale in India versus more rooftop in Europe?
Two things. On the first point, there is this question about how much comes from the central government, how much comes from the state or the regions or the provinces, some cases even the cities. There is not a one rule fits everything. There is not a magic rule, but one. which is they should be aligned as much as possible.
Yeah.
Because the thing that really cannot happen and should never happen is that the central government says something and the state say the contrary.
Right.
In some cases, you may have a situation, which happened several times in the United States, where the states were more proactive than the federal government.
Yes.
That's not necessarily negative, of course, as long as I said, the central government does not become an opposition to the state. So once again, one can be more advanced than the other in the role of pushing forward, but what should never happen is to have a real clash of regulations and policies that actually are contradicting each other, because that's a nightmare for the investors, and then the investors do a very simple thing. They go somewhere else. Because remember something, I mean, whatever the increase in velocity of capacity of deployment of renewables is today, there are pipelines of other projects which are 10 times bigger. So the financial sector needs only 1 minute to decide to finance something else in another corner of the world, and not here or not there, because here it becomes too cumbersome. This is question number one. Now the benchmark. The first thing I would say is that in total numbers now the growth equals the velocity of Europe and United States. You asked in terms of split between local utilities. The utility scale, this is stronger in India so far. Let's see how this develops. This is also not just in India. This has happened also in China. It has happened also in other places. We may see a change in this trend, because the more solar PV becomes affordable for small businesses or for commercial businesses or for industries, and even in some countries to single customers that need to be rich, however, then for self-consumption it becomes a motor that is almost unstoppable. We have seen this in Australia. We have seen this in Europe, in Belgium, because there is a very favorable connection conditions, and we will soon see it in California. Now, this is one part. The second part, which is a geographical shift, the solar and wind were born in Europe. Solar can expand in Europe, but there is one thing that cannot be changed. The demand, the peak demand, is in winter at night. And this is at odds with the fact that the solar shines more in summer during the day. Now, this is not necessarily your case. So you have much more consumption, and in particular for an increasing cooling demand during the day. It may not be exactly the same hour of the peak of solar PV. It could be shifted by 3, 4, 5 hours.
Within the same 24 hours.
It is within the same 12 hours, and in that respect, then suddenly electric batteries become interesting, because they are not enough at this stage to ensure a 24-hour, let's say, storage or availability, but they start to be interesting and affordable enough to play with the 3-4 hours difference. So you could have excessive solar in the midday. You store this electricity, and then you reuse it at 7 p.m. where you have the peak. This is option number one. Option number two, which is even more refined, you do thermal. You change demand, or you use thermal storage. Thermal in terms of cold. You produce some cold water or chilled or ice, and then you use this, and this of course costs today 30 times less than battery.
So it's interesting, because there's a question from Monica who's asking this question about technologies. She says, the recent IEA findings reveal that only 4 out of 38 clean energy technologies are on track for long-term climate goals. So the question is, why are we focusing on a limited number of sources when there are other options like tidal energy, carbon capture, etc.? So why is it that, while there's so much progress on solar PV and wind, other technologies are lagging behind?
There are two aspects of the question. The first is to say, The first answer is, from an IEA perspective, we absolutely think that we need a wide set of technology options, not just renewables, but other low carbon, including carbon capture and storage, that for instance is one of the few decarbonization methods in industry. So we are absolutely technology open.
Sure.
Having said so, in our scenarios, energy efficiency technologies plus renewable technologies are the one that systematically lead to 80% of global mitigation, climate change mitigation by 2040.
Yeah.
The rest, the remaining 20% is fuel switch, carbon capture and storage, nuclear or other technology.
Right.
So energy efficiency and renewables are the main ones.
Right.
This is why we're focusing on renewables and energy efficiency. Now, within renewables, absolutely correct question. We should focus more on other technologies as well. Now, solar made a tremendous progress because of the push of the manufacturing in China that really made two things. One, economies of scale.
Yes.
And second, increased quality.
Yeah.
I've heard so many times the issue, the question, but Chinese modules are bad quality. I'm very sorry, but the first tier companies in China are among the best in the world in terms of quality of modules, and they have the best chief technology offices of the world. Many of those are Australian.
Right.
So, the quality and quantity. This happened with solar, it happened with wind, it is going on with these two technologies, it's far away from being stopped. We are at the edge of another revolution in the solar technologies, so with a complete new generation of even more efficient and then potentially cheaper technologies coming, and maybe I will say more on that. But the question is absolutely right. We have to do much more, for instance, in renewable heat, or in renewable transport.
Yes.
Heat is the accounts for 50% of total final consumption in the world.
Yes.
There are many countries in the world that have absolute zero policies for renewable heat. Everything is concentrated on renewable electricity.
Correct.
So the question is absolutely well posed. It's our focus at the IEA to go beyond solar and wind. Solar and wind is a success story that will continue, but we have to look at all the other technologies, both for heating and cooling and for transport.
In fact, just 2 weeks ago, Paolo, I was in San Francisco, where we were looking at automation, artificial intelligence, blockchain, new disruptive technologies, and how they might impact the energy or low carbon sector. And one of the issues on which we were trying to deliberate was, how do we use renewables for high intensity heat? How do we use renewables or clean energy technologies for industrial purposes?
Very good.
And if India, India likes to miss many buses. We miss the on a technology front, but at least we've been quick to adopt the technology. So now, if we have to look ahead, if you were advising the Prime Minister here, or the Power Minister, or the Renewables Minister, what would you say we take a bet on in terms of the next generation of technologies that still are being sort of in the developed, and where India can come in strong?
What is very clearly coming is the cleaning of industry, which is worth thousands and thousands of terawatt hours and billions of tons of CO2 emission mitigation. And let me give you an example why. Two things are happening. First, and this is based, either through direct electrification of industrial processes, through cheap renewable electricity, or indirectly through the production of green hydrogen. When I say green, based from electrolysis of renewable electricity. And why is this suddenly possible, and it was not in the radars even 2-3 years ago? Because because it's linked again to the technology progress of PV and wind.
Right.
There are some places in the world, and India is one, by the way, where you can have the following combination. You mix very cheap solar with very cheap wind, and you have electricity at a generation cost of equal or lower than $3 per kilowatt hour,
Right.
for at least 4,000 full load hours during the year. Why these full load hours is important? Because then you need to supply with this electricity another asset, which are the electrolyzers to produce hydrogen, which has high fixed costs, and this asset, of course, would like to be used for 8,000 hours a year, and 4,000 is the lower threshold where this use becomes economically interesting.
Right.
So suddenly, from one year to another, there is an increased attention on the production of green hydrogen.
Right.
And the green hydrogen then can be the precursor of many other chemicals. Hydrogen remains difficult to store and to transport because of the low density, but you can, for instance, produce ammonia.
Right.
And ammonia can be used as a chemical and as a precursor for fertilizers,
Right,
and this is
right.
obviously a very important argument
Right.
for India. So
Yes.
you ask me for an advice, I would go in that direction to look at the potential of green hydrogen, ammonia production, fertilizers industry, agri-food in India, because that's obviously relevant here. But this is only the start. Then hydrogen can be used in many other chemical sectors. Ammonia can be used also as a fuel itself, not in cities and not for single customers, but in industrial setting
Right.
or in ships. And by the way, I expect a big attention in all this area the next year, because Japan will put hydrogen at the center of its focus on energy during its G20 presidency next year. So this is one other big revolution coming, which has only started now. A number of big companies are looking at that in Europe as well. Siemens, for instance, we have impressive progress in the reduction of cost of electrolyzers if the economies of scale are joined. There is really a big technology interest that is coming. I see this as a new frontier for technology.
And where would you put the investment in battery-related storage technologies? I mean, I know I'm myself part of some conversations that the government is having with some research institutions and industry players on how do we have a strategic push towards storage in India. So what would you bet on? Should we continue with lithium ion because everyone else is doing lithium ion? Or should we do something else?
You stretch my knowledge here because I'm not an expert in this. I observe that there are a number of technologies that are being studied. I would say, first of all, there are two streams. They are equally important. One is transportation, because electric cars will come, and electric cars, not just cars, electric vehicles.
Yes.
So including buses, including 2-3 wheelers, and cars will be the dominant transport mode in cities and will revolutionize cities, full stop. But the second then are stationary applications for these 3-4 hour shift of demand and supply. And then here there are a number of possible solutions. Some of them are at a very early stage. I see with great interest the experiments in the United States on redox batteries.
Yes.
There are a number of technologies. I would say the most important thing here is to keep technology competition open. So whatever the policy should be, they should remain technology open.
We've been pushing for technology agnostic.
Look, sorry for interrupting. Technology agnostic, yes, with one important caveat. You always have to compete technologies that are roughly at the same level of maturity. It makes no sense to make a technology agnostic policy that makes PV in competition with something which is with ocean.
Sure.
This makes absolutely no sense.
Sure.
But to make compete technologies, so for instance some electric batteries or some other type of storage that are roughly at the same type of early R&D and D, this makes a lot of sense.
That then brings me to this issue of manufacturing. There's a question from Sumit saying, what is the future of the solar business in India given that safeguard duties could come into effect? And this is an ongoing debate. Should we push deployment or should we push manufacturing? In an ideal world, we should be doing both.
Both.
But then in trying to support manufacturing, say through safeguard duties or other trade remedies, are we going to impact the deployment very negatively over the long run, or is it a bitter pill we swallow for the short run and then build up the manufacturing capacity at home?
Let me respond like this. I think, and I'm not just thinking about India, but more generally about these arguments, I think we are looking at the wrong answers to a right question. The right question is the following: how can renewables deployment be translated in real, tangible benefits for the local community?
Yeah.
This is a very good question.
Yeah.
Because everywhere this is not only understandable, but it's a must as a driver for the renewables deployment.
Right.
I'm saying this because I was last week in a workshop on Africa. We discussed exactly the same thing. Then the question is how to do it. Is it a voluntary approach? Is it a mandatory approach? So you didn't ask it, but the question about local content.
Exactly.
So mandatory local manufacturing.
Yes.
Is this a good tool? Is this a bad tool? And then the import tariffs. In my view, the mandatory approaches are in the end not very effective on the long term. They can give a certain relief in the short term, and even this is not really true. I mean, on the same argument, Europe introduced import tariffs to Chinese solar modules some times ago. This has not impeded for European PV industry to completely be crashed and not compete with
Correct.
the Chinese.
Correct.
That's not the way to solve it. If you want really to compete at that level, you have to have a crash program that looks at the fundamentals of manufacturing. But
Exactly.
my second question would be, is this really needed?
Right. Right.
Is this really, does India need to be in the cell manufacturing
Exactly.
in order to give the benefits to the local community? I don't think so. There is a lot of the rest of the systems
Yes.
in terms of installations, of electronics, of software. You are world champions in software, in everything. More and more we will go in a world where software will be as important than hardware, probably more important than hardware. Think about connecting all the information between distributed generation,
Exactly.
electric vehicles management, the
Stability
recharging
of the
station,
grid.
stability of the grid. This will be mainly driven by software, not
Yes.
by hardware.
Yes.
These are huge opportunities that India has without any of these tools of import tariffs, of mandatory local. This will just come because if you are in a certain region, you will need all these things in order to develop the right system. So my strong advice would be, the question is very good. How to bring the benefit to the local people and the local communities. I disagree with the tools. With the measure. I don't think the measure are useful. I actually think that they are detrimental. I'm speaking about the import duties. They create a non-necessary level of extra cost and another uncertainty level for the investors, which will react, as I just said before. They will go somewhere else. This is more difficult.
But let me loop back to something you started with. You know, we asked about the locomotive, and China was the locomotive both in deployment and in manufacturing. When you said three other regions are sort of tied together, Europe, US and India. On the manufacturing side, do you see the potential for supply chains to be developed across these three regions? Rather than each region thinking, they've got to do end-to-end product design to development to production, all on their own. Maybe we could reduce some of the scope for disputes if there were long supply chains across these regions.
Actually, they are, and this is one of the reasons why these tariffs actually don't make sense. I mean, at the time when the European tariffs were introduced, most of the manufacturing equipment in China was coming from Germany and Italy.
Correct.
So guess who was also hit by these tariffs? The same industries from the European countries.
Yeah.
So partly this is already existing, and by the way, this is also partly true for the American situation right now. So this is another reason why not to specialize. Now, India has not the same level of development in that kind of part of the supply chain, but it can have in other parts. So once again, I would be rather go the other way around to look at what are the whole range of opportunities over the supply chain. And you are totally right. It does not mean that India needs to develop everything from A to Z. It could have a big economic development just specializing on part of the supply chains with the specific objective. This is a very good question. I really repeat it again, to bring the benefits to the local communities.
We have about 10 minutes left in this Twitter chat, so if you've got any burning questions, please send them in. We are talking with Dr. Paolo Frankl, head of the International Energy Agency's Renewable Energy Division. Paolo, let me turn to, you talked about forecasts earlier of the 5 years. Let's look beyond that. Let's look into the world of scenarios.
Yes.
Where do you think there could be a massive, to use the football analogy since the World Cup is going on, a left of field curveball coming in and putting all of this to a stop? What is there a potential major stumbling block that we are not forecasting or not thinking about in our scenarios?
But I'm not sure there is one single, but there is a combination of many circumstances that could make investments in renewables and in energy efficiency too risky, and then the financial sector would deviate their attention to something else.
Sure.
In this respect, I see three levels that are really the main barriers remaining. One remains policy uncertainty in itself. So you have a democratic, very welcome government change, and suddenly you may have very abrupt policy changes. Abrupt policy changes in a sector where investment decision cycles are in the order of decades is very detrimental.
Exactly.
So
no one's going to take a 3-decade bet. You will have 5 changes of government, 6 changes of government in 3 decades.
Italy is a world champion in this, but that's exactly the point. So you have to make sure that whatever happens in the governments, there is a continuity in the policies. Now, let me give a positive example on that. The Nordic countries recently have done a very interesting experiment. So they have discussed the energy transition with a wide range of stakeholders, from industry to governments, even to civil society, NGOs, and blah blah. And they have come to an agreement, which is now very clearly the desire of the population, regardless of who is in power. This assures that in the Netherlands, in Sweden, in Denmark, this is locked in now. The energy transition is locked in. Nobody will dare to say we change everything. But we could have these changes somewhere else. So Mexico made one of the biggest energy reforms with this administration. The next one, if a certain candidate wins, he said already officially that he wants to revert everything. So that's a risk.
Sure.
This is risk number one. The second is affordable financing for developing countries, because again, this is Africa, but not just Africa. It's also part of other countries, including India. I was about to say, and if there are not good rules, the financing will not go there. And the third is system integration. The fact that renewables is a success story, but mainly in PV and wind, has a fundamental question. You need to go in parallel with system integration and look at all the enablers of more flexible power system. Otherwise, you can hit the wall. These are the 3 factors to step in, and there could be a combination of factors that could stop everything. Now, having said so, we are speaking about these stopping factors in 2030. Let's see where we are in 2030 with climate change. and let's see how the perception of climate change will change in society.
Mhm.
I'm afraid we are in a big fight against time.
Sure.
We are severely underestimating the cost of adaptation.
Correct.
And we have already situations where in Europe we have not just more thunderstorms, but cyclones and floodings and macro event of at a level.
Exactly.
France was invaded by rain in the May like never in the past.
Oh, you look at Puerto Rico, it's just the entire power system shut down for weeks.
Well, is society still going to admit that? I think there will be also a shift in the perception of wider set of the population. In the past, it was obvious. In the developing countries, the people who would say, my first priority is to eat,
Sure.
and who cares about climate change?
Sure.
This is fully understandable. But the world, fortunately, is evolving everywhere.
Yes.
And then the perception of the gravity of the climate change, in my opinion, will also be an additional push.
I think that was also one of the reasons why India came forward in its nationally determined contribution for the Paris negotiations, realizing that this is, if the climate is not going to change, it is already changing. It is already impacting tropical countries like India. So while the problem might have been created by others, we have to be part of the solution. Let's try to end on a high note.
Yes.
There's a question from Monica. Again, what is the one big change that India has witnessed in the renewable energy sector in the last decade? I think we've answered that, but I'm going to rephrase that question. We are now in 2018. Our National Action Plan on Climate Change was actually announced in 2008.
Yes.
Soon after, in the G7 summit of Heiligendamm, we had announced that our per capita emissions would never exceed that of the developed countries. So it's actually 10 years of the National Action Plan on Climate Change. So let me rephrase Monica's question. If we had to go back 10 years ago and look out, forecasts or scenarios, would we ever imagine this to have happened? And if not, what is the big change that we can fantasize about over the next 10 years?
The big change, I would say there are several, but the biggest is certainly with solar PV, and then the next ones are several. The solar PV, let me respond with an anecdote which is personal.
Okay.
In 2014, so much later than your 2008, we did an update of the roadmap of solar PV because we felt that our old 2010 was completely out of date. And for the first time we said solar PV plus concentrated solar power may become the first source of electricity by 2050. But one thing we were completely wrong, the costs. We were predicting costs for 2050 that are now already surpassed now in 2018. So I was wrong just by 32 years. You see? Now, this almost nobody saw coming at this level. And I expect that similar things could happen. Actually, this happened also in LEDs.
Sure.
And India was part of this phenomenal change.
Sure.
I could expect this to happen with electric batteries, with electric vehicles, and also with hydrogen, maybe.
So I have one final question, Paolo, from Rachit, and then I have one question of mine, which is renewable energy does answer our energy needs, but it also adds to the waste. Given that PV-related waste in Europe is forecast to reach 35,000 tons by 2020, what would be a good way to deal with such an inevitable future? And this is a problem that we're all going to face. So what's the IEA's thinking on this?
The IEA thinking is very, very clear. The IEA has technology collaboration programs, and the one on PV established an end-of-life and recycling task already 12 years ago. And this industry is one of the few in the world that has thought about end-of-life and recycling from the onset. So I don't consider this at all
and oversight.
And not at all. And all the precious metals, not the silicon, but all the precious metals that are in the context, I can tell you, nobody will lose them.
Correct.
These will all be reused. So I think there is a life cycle thinking that can be easily implemented. And frankly speaking, 35,000 tons, if you look at the whole material flows in Europe, I'm not concerned at all.
Yeah. Well, and for the benefit of our viewers, again, CEW works on critical mineral resources for India as well for our industrial development. 2 years ago, we published the first major study of its kind, examining 49 different critical minerals that would drive our industrial growth. But of course, as the energy transition happens, as electric vehicles come onto the streets, etc., different minerals change in their criticality. And we are now working very closely with various arms of government to establish a more dynamic approach towards assessing criticality and introducing a circular economy of dealing with these minerals. One final question to you, Paolo. Given that you missed your forecast by 32 years about prices, on the cost.
Yes.
And given the dynamism that is going on in this sector, will the IEA set up its Renewable Energy Division in India?
That's,
will you shift base?
this is not so easy in the sense that the IEA is a small organization. In the Secretariat, we are less than 300 people, and we only have Paris as a headquarters. But as you know, India has become an association partner, an association country in 2017.
Right.
We are accelerating dramatically the collaboration with you, with the Indian government, with a number of think tanks, including yours. We are making written memorandum of understandings and agreement, which are really welcome. We have a contact person who works for us here in Delhi, so we are making progress. I cannot answer to you right away that we will be able to open an office in India ever soon, but definitely our focus will be more and more on India, also on renewables. That's for sure.
Dr. Paolo Frankl, thank you very much for joining on Hero Future Energy's chat with us. Thank you.